Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Class Unity discussion. Today, we will be speaking with Robert C. Hockett on money, how it works, and how it relates to banking, capital, and investment, as well as his case for a set of reforms designed to socialize investment. Robert Hockett is Edward Cornell Professor of Law at Cornell Law School. His research lies in the fields of organizational, financial, and monetary law and economics, in both their positive and normative, as well as their national and transnational dimensions. His recent books include Making Capital Democratic and Spread the Fed, Distributed Central Banking for Productive Republican Finance. Robert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sebastian, and thanks, comrades. It's kind of cool to be in this particular position. I've usually been in the same position as all of the rest of you as we've talked to people like Michael Heinrich and Christian Parenti and others. So it's a very heady responsibility suddenly to be occupying this position. So Sebastian sort of suggested that we sort of divide our session into two, and so we begin first with the idea of Vixelian endogenous money, which figures kind of centrally in the Forbes piece that you guys have kindly read. And then in the second half, sort of on that basis, I guess we'll talk about this other paper that you guys kindly wrote, The Socialization of Investment, that is sort of predicated on the claims in regard to Vixelian credit money or endogenous money made in the first piece. So this turns out, I think, to be a sort of an intuitively attractive way of proceeding. So I double thanks to Hephaestion for suggesting it this way, because I was even planning right from the outset on noting sort of an interesting feature of what we'll be talking about today, which is that this is a case where you actually can build up the macro from the micro, right? In other words, a kind of a typical mistake that's made by orthodox macroeconomics today is to sort of think of macro as simply a simple summing up of or aggregating of micro matters. And in doing that, of course, they commit what Keynes sort of canonically referred to as a fallacy of composition, or what's also known sometimes as a paradox of aggregation. And in rough and ready terms, you could say essentially it's a confusing of the whole with the sum of its parts. And sometimes a whole is the sum of its parts, but in many other cases, it's not, because the structure that determines the interrelations of those parts is as constitutive of the whole that we're talking about as are those parts themselves. And so usually, of course, I think it behooves us to be really careful to make sure that we're not kind of falsely simply summing up micro elements in order to arrive at a macro object. But there are some cases or some respects in which you can do something kind of like that, at least insofar as a whole or a macro object can be viewed as sort of rooted in certain micro foundations that you can kind of lay out. And in this case, we have a circumstance of that sort, which is which makes it kind of easy, or at least relatively straightforward, to kind of render accessible to intuition the nature of the system that we have or that we're dealing with. It's not to say that the whole that we're going to get to just is a sum of its parts, but it is to say that when we talk a little bit about the basic structure of the parts, it'll be very easy to comprehend the whole once we sort of add what we have to get there. So the kind of micro element that I think is most important for our purposes today is just the typical bank loan, right? The typical bank installment loan. And if we look at how that happens, if we look at sort of how a bank lending transaction takes place, if we, in other words, get into the sort of fine-grained details, we're very well situated after that then to sort of understand why our sort of money capital system and why our financial system is as it is. And we're also very well situated as a result of that to sort of understand why it is that a socialization of investment is not only possible, but is actually imperative. In other words, even such private ordering as we have in our economy, even given that we have all these monopolies and oligopolies making things a little bit different than the standard privately ordered model, but even given what private ordering we have or might want to retain in the economy, at least one thing has to be socialized, I believe. I don't think that even the most rabid free marketer in the end can deny that one thing has to be socialized, and that's investment in the sense or in the form that we'll be discussing it today. So let me build up to let me get right to the beginning then, to the way a bank loan works, and then we'll sort of build up from there. And Vixelian endogenous money, which Efestian asked me to kind of unpack, is quite readily understandable once we sort of lay this out, right? So a common fallacy, I think, or a common assumption that people make, and certainly that I used to make as a kid, was to think that banks basically collect money from depositors and then they lend that money out, right? So they form a big pool of lendable money capital that is basically comes to them in the form of deposits made by moms and pops and businesses and others. And then out of that pool, right, out of that aggregation, they choose, sort of prudent loans to be extended sort of out of that pool. And that's just not actually how bank lending works, and it's not actually how banking works. Moreover, it never has been. That's what makes this doubly ironic. Even if you go all the way back to the origins of modern banking in sort of late medieval, early Renaissance Italy, even then, banking didn't work in the way people tend to think nowadays. I actually do think there's a kind of conspiracy theory story that can be told about why we keep thinking this way. And that is that basically the financial sector, the financiers, are quite happy if we think of it that way, right? Because then we tend to think that we need them. We tend to think that they are the suppliers of the scarce capital that we have to use in order to sort of progress or accumulate or build, and that therefore they have some kind of right to sort of call the shots and to sort of determine how things are going to proceed. So I'm guessing that there's a sort of a class explanation or a sort of public choice style explanation that one can give in explaining or sort of at least conjecturing why it is that we have this idea. But in fact, again, it's just not the story. In fact, if you were to look at the entirety of the deposits under management by any particular depository institution, particularly a commercial bank of the kind that dominates our banking sector today, by far the greater part of those deposits under management are deposits that in a certain sense have been made by the bank itself. And I'll explain how that is the case. And one way to kind of anticipate what we'll be talking about shortly is that portion of deposits we can think of then as endogenous money, which is to say it's money that's generated within the system itself rather than coming into the system from without. If all that banks had under management in their sort of deposit portfolios, as it were deposits that were made by people like us, where we got the money elsewhere and then brought it into the bank, those, of course, would be then exogenous money from the perspective of the bank. They wouldn't have been internally generated funds. They would have been simply received funds from a sort of external source or sources. But what I'm claiming here is that by far the greater part of the total deposits and other liabilities, many other liabilities for that matter, under management by a commercial bank are actually endogenously generated, with only a smaller portion taking the form of exogenously made deposits. Now, what do I mean by that? How does one explain these terms? Well, this is where looking at the actual micro detail, which is not that terribly complicated, by the way, of an ordinary lending transaction facilitates our sort of understanding things quite well, right? Makes things very simple and accessible to intuition. So the way it works is this. Let's say that I need to borrow money in order to buy a car. When I first got to Ithaca to take this teaching job, everybody said, you really have to have a car around here. There's no real serious public transportation of the kind that you're used to in real cities. Moreover, it tends to snow pretty heavily here, so you really ought to buy the official automobile of Cornell University, which is the Subaru, the all-wheel drive Subaru. So I go over to the Subaru dealer and I find, an older one. It's basically like the last one left from the previous model year. So it'll be kind of new for me, but even if it's not new style-wise. And it turns out it costs $14,000. And I don't have that kind of cash readily available. So I go over to the bank, which I did. This is a true story, right? So I go to Tompkins Trust, our cute little community bank, And when you go in to ask for this loan, right, they want to find out whether you're credit worthy, and they want to find out, whether they're going to make a little money off of this transaction. They want it to be a sort of safe investment from their point of view, but they also want it to be a profitable investment from their point of view. So they run the credit check, they interview you, they talk to you to get a feeling for whether they can count on you. They ask for proof of income, and since I had just gotten a professor job, I could sort of readily supply that. Once they decide that I am indeed a good risk in that sense, we, in effect, contract together, right? I sign what's known as a promissory note, which contractually commits me to paying back the principal on that loan. That's to say the borrowed amount, in addition, of course, to some interest that's tacked on and any other sort of borrowing fees that are part of the transaction. Now, here's where things get kind of interesting. The standard sort of mythological view of the way banking works would have, one part of this transaction or one step in it would be a case where the loan officer goes into the vault and says, hold on, let me make sure we got enough to lend to you. And so he walks over into the vault and makes sure that the pallets with all of the bound bills or the kind of round bill wads that you might have seen in Breaking Bad or something are numerous enough that they've got enough to lend without violating the reserve requirement regulations or something like that. But that's just not what happens. Instead, what happens is once I've signed that note and handed it over to the loan officer, they either open a new bank account in my name in the amount of the loan, or they credit my pre-existing account with them in the amount of the loan, or they cut a cashier's check for me to take and deposit at some other bank if that's where I do my banking, right? And they don't take this from some pre-existing stock of money. They don't, see, can we borrow whatever we don't have in the vault from fellow Federal Reserve member banks or something like that? No, they simply credit my account. Now, so far, that's just credit, right? And it's credit that's dollar denominated, but it's not yet monetary unless there's an additional step. The additional step, of course, is that every bank, including Tompkins Trust, the bank that I banked with, are networked into a national payment system, an electronified national payment system that is overseen and administered by the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve runs the payment system and has done so since 1917, right? In other words, ever since 4 years after it was founded, it's done this. And what that makes happen is that if I go across the street to the Duane Reade and want to purchase something, and let's say I want to purchase it out of this account that Tompkins Trust has opened and credited in my name, I use a bank card that is associated with that account. It's got a chip or a strip or something, and I put it into a reader, and then it counts, right? The reader counts that as money, right? It sort of verifies that there is indeed a bona fide account associated with this card and that it does have sufficient funds to cover the transaction, right? And so it is that payment system it's that sort of integration into the payment system that renders the credit spendable, that renders it monetary, right? And what that means then is that the bank has, in a certain sense, quote unquote, created this money. I sort of don't like that term because I don't think it's actually creating it so much as it's sort of generating it or it's channeling it, because ultimately, as we'll see, it's the Fed that's doing the creating or the generating here. But the bank is operating at least as a kind of a gatekeeper, as a kind of loan officer for the Fed system itself, right? But in any event, what makes it monetary is, again, this integration into the payment system. You can sort of check your intuition here by sort of imagining the same story, except now imagine you're borrowing the money from me. And imagine that I've got some equipment in my basement or something so that I can actually make little laminated cards that are of the same nature as, credit cards or debit cards or whatever. And I'm able to make these things and put really impressive looking little silver boxes at one end that look like a chip. And then I can put a sort of a fake strip on the back that looks like something that would be magnetically readable. And you asked if you can borrow $14,000 from me. And I say, yeah, sure. Here, I'll credit your account. And I give you this card. But you go over to Duane Reade and you slip it into the reader or slide it through the reader and nothing happens. You can't spend it, right? I'm not able to generate, in other words, spendable credit, but the bank is. And what makes that in turn possible, again, is that the bank is part of a public sector system. Indeed, you can sort of think of the banking system as a kind of public-private partnership. The closest analogy would actually be a franchise arrangement. In a sense, the franchisor is the Federal Reserve System, and the franchisees are the banks that essentially disseminate this credit money that the government, in effect, generates. Now, what does Vixel have to do with any of this? Why do I refer to something as Vixelian? Well, I often refer to Vixel as the sort of greatest economist you've never heard of. In the immediate aftermath of the 2008 crash, I used to say Irving Fisher is the greatest economist you've never heard of. But now I think Vixel is actually even more interesting than Fisher, although I still adore Fisher. In any event, Swedish economist, writes either in Swedish or in German. Therefore, of course, no English speakers read him. Hence, he remains relatively obscure to Americans and to English folk and other people who are part of the Anglosphere for decades and decades and decades. But what Vixel essentially did was he sort of noted, he began as a lawyer and actually as a left-wing journalist. He was essentially a troublemaker, a kind of a left-wing feuilletonist, or whatever you call those things in Europe. But he got increasingly interested in economics as part of this kind of left-wing agitating that he was doing via his journalism, and so decided to kind of learn more about economics, and then became basically sometimes he's referred to as the father of modern mathematical economics, that kind of thing. But unlike a lot of mathematical economists, Vixel had a real eye for institutions and institutional detail, and a real eye for the role that institutions play in constituting an economy. And then hence that the law plays in constituting an economy, since the law constitutes those institutions. And he referred to this kind of credit money that was generated by the banks or via the banks, using the banks as kind of outlets for public sector disseminate or issuance as bank money. Right. And he noted that there are two possible regimes where bank money is concerned. One is a case where the nation as a whole is legally committed to some metallic standard, like the gold standard, right? And if the country in question is indeed committed to a standard like that, then of course there are inherent limits placed upon the generatability of this bank money, right? Only so much can be generated. But he also sort of prophetically, since he's writing in 1907, he sort of prophetically foresaw a day that he saw coming, when we would actually dump these ridiculous metallic money standards and go with fiat money that would essentially amount to a managed currency sort of regime. And he foresaw that once the world sort of moves in that direction, the central banks will be managing the currency, which is to say they will be determining the supplies, right? They'll be modulating the supplies, perhaps disseminating more when things are slowing down in the economy, perhaps disseminating less or even pulling out more to sort of slow things down when the economy is overheating. And so he put together fairly sophisticated models of both regimes, what things would look like under a bank money regime where there's also a gold standard or some such thing, and then what a regime would look like where you don't have some standard like that. And he recognized, again, it's amazing how early he saw this, given how almost commonplace among real economists it is now. But he sort of foresaw that, okay, the managed currency system that we'll probably move to, when combined with the endogeneity of bank-generated credit money, when combined with that, it's both, there's sort of a blessing and a curse here. There's great promise, but there's also great peril, right? The promise, of course, is that you don't ever have to worry that there's not going to be enough money to sort of match up with desired transaction volume in the productive sectors. There's never going to be a shortage, in other words, of finance capital to finance real productive investment that then produces enough in the way of goods and services to absorb whatever additional money is generated in order to enable that to happen, right? He saw that as the sort of promise of this kind of system. The peril, of course, is the possibility of overgeneration, right? If you had a central bank that didn't understand its mandate or didn't understand its responsibility and task, it might, generate credit money far in excess of the economy's productive capacity, and hence its capacity to generate sufficient goods and services as to absorb the additional credit money that's being generated. That, of course, would be inflation or hyperinflation. And of course, it also was possible, he noted, for a central bank under a regime like this to sort of under-issue as well, which is essentially what the Fed itself did in the immediate aftermath of the 1929 crash, right? That there might not be enough money generated. So basically when you get off of fiat money, there's a new responsibility that the central bank or monetary authority has. And that comes itself with promise and peril, right? And you've got to make sure that whoever the monetary authority or the central bank is understands the mandate and the nature of what it's doing and what money itself actually is in our system, to sort of modulate those supplies well, right? To sort of make sure that never too much, never too little. I sometimes tell my students, because it's sort of helpful for them to have mnemonics sometimes, since law students have to remember so much stuff every day, that they should just think of inflation or deflation as a relation. And I'll sometimes tell my students, say this 3 times. Inflation is a relation. Inflation is, in essence, it's just the relation between the money supply and the goods and services supply. And one way of viewing the central monetary authority task or the central banking task is as sort of making sure the supplies of both sort of move in tandem, right? So that as essentially productive capacity grows and production itself increases, the money supply is expanding rapidly enough to absorb, to sort of finance both the producing and the consuming. And then if the economy is sort of slowing down and there's sort of less that's being produced, less production, less in the way of services, then you don't want to keep generating more and more and more money, because of course that just means there's going to be that much more money chasing the same supply of goods or whatever. So you want to avoid the inflationary risk, which is what the latter is, and you want to avoid the deflationary risk, which is what the former is. Now, the thing about this sort of Vixelian take on things that I sort of noted when I decided to sort of look a bit into the history, the sort of pre-Vixelian history of monetary thought and then the post-Vixelian, is that it seems that there have been sort of pockets of understanding among thinkers of matters monetary going back for centuries, right? I chose Vixel as the sort of fulcrum, largely because he's the sort of last in this tradition to sort of foreshadow what would happen once we move to fiat money, which we didn't do until shortly after he wrote in this way. I also choose him because he's the most contemporary sort of exponent and also the most unjustly ignored, it seems to me. But if you go back further, of course, lots of other people understood this as well, right? Alexander Hamilton, for example, in the US experience, understood it. Sir James Stewart, one of the Scottish Enlightenment figures, whose treatise on political economy came out 10 years before Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, understood it. Stewart, by the way, is utterly awe-inspiring, and he's actually the only one of those old political economists whom even Marx seems to have admired. So I can't recommend him too highly, but he's writing in the 1760s. He knew this and observed this about money. John Law, who sort of overdid it, also understood this. Indeed, what led him to overdo it was that he recognized that this could be done, but he didn't recognize what the limits should be. So, there are currents of what you might think of as sort of proto-endogenous money theory, or maybe endogenous money proto-theory, going back way, way, way back. And then, of course, many people who have followed Vixel, for example, J.M. Keynes of the treatise, the 1930 rather than the 1936 general theory, read Vixel quite avidly because he could read German. And indeed, he even described his own treatise on money, which is actually more admired than the general theory by many people, particularly monetary economists. He himself said in the treatise that he's sort of channeling Vixel for English speakers, right? And then, of course, the MMTers, who sort of take as their point of departure the Keynes of the treatise, along with Friedrich Knapp and a few others, they're basically just the latest version of this same basic idea, right? So it's a venerable understanding, but it's always been, for whatever reason, a kind of minority or subterranean understanding. And my guess is the reason is the ideological reason that I noted before, that basically the finance sector or the financiers and the bankers don't want you to know this, because if you know it, then you understand that financial institutions are not mere intermediaries, and you know that the money or the credit money supply are not sort of gifts by virtuously saving rich people, but instead are public emanations that should be publicly managed. So that's basically the thrust of that first piece that you guys kindly read, and it's basically what I'm sort of getting at when I refer to Vixelian endogenous money. It's why I call myself sometimes a left Vixelian, although I hesitate to say that because I'm actually much more Marxist than Vixelian. But if you're in polite society among monetary economists, they kind of don't want to hear too much about the Marx stuff. So it's a little bit more politic to describe yourself as a left Vixelian. A brief word on Marx in this connection, though, by the way, that it seems to me worth making, particularly given our own commitments and given how much of what we do and discuss as a group comes from Marx. One matter on which I've often sort of broken with various MMT friends, and some MMTers are quite close friends of mine, but I'm not an MMTer. My friends call me a fellow traveler. That's basically what I am as far as what they do is concerned. But one of the things on which we've sometimes disagreed, many of them seem to think that Marx was committed to a commodity theory of money or to a gold standard understanding of money, and that therefore he's too sort of retrograde for modern understanding. I think the mistake that these people make when they say this is the following. It is true that what was called money in Marx's day was indeed metallically constrained, right? There was a gold standard in effect in those days. And so what was called money was indeed metallically based. But what functioned as money was a much broader class of things. And Marx had a name for that too, right? Fictitious capital. Marx also had a very lively understanding of the role that bills of exchange played in a kind of de facto monetary system in the contemporary economies of his day. Indeed, people often talk about Walter Bagehot's, sort of marvelous portrayal of what the Bank of England was doing and how it worked to sort of constrain when it was doing what it should do, constrain credit when it had to, and then to sort of liquefy and add more credit when it was needed. And his entire focus was on bills of exchange. And Marx recognized that these bills of exchange are de facto money, de facto monetary, and indeed all forms of fictitious capital are de facto monetary. But it would have been inaccurate for him to refer to them as money, to use the word Geld about those things back then, because they weren't called money back then, even if they had the functions of money, of credit money, actually, and indeed endogenous credit money. So if you go to volume 3 in particular, another sort of sad thing about, or for another misfortune of our dear Uncle Carl's, is that almost nobody reads volume 2 or volume 3, right? And indeed, Uncle Carl is lucky if he gets people even to read a part of volume 1. But if you start with chapter 25 of volume 3 and then read to the end, and then go back and read all 3 volumes of Capital in sequence, it becomes really, really clear that the person with, I think, the most sophisticated and wide-ranging and comprehensive understanding of money understood in functional terms, right? The monetary function and the credit money function, I think in the entire modern era, is Marx, right? It's just that it's a little bit harder to find because he was a polymath and a universal genius, which Vixel was not, and nobody else in the 19th century really seems to have been. But it's there, and I'm finding myself mining. I've been over the last, I don't know how many years, mining volumes 2 and 3 for ideas and insights and understanding, because I still feel like I'm still kind of struggling or groping to reach the degree of understanding that our beloved Carl had. That's a little bit of a side observation, but again, it seems like it's not altogether out of order to make it, since we're all followers to a degree, or at least all admirers of Marx. So I don't think that Vixel said anything that Marx didn't know. It's just that people who won't read Marx for any number of reasons maybe will read Vixel. And then as far as endogenous money is concerned, that one narrow topic, Vixel is quite elegant on it. So it seems like he's worth reading if people don't have the time to read Capital Volume 3. So I guess, is that a good place to stop for the moment, Hephaestion?
Yeah, that's great, Robert. Thank you. So let's just take a moment and go over if there are any questions for people. I just want to ask a question about the Fed's role in price stability, and get your sense of what the typical story we hear versus what you think. Is it the same or is it different? So from what I understand, the typical story is that the Fed balances uh, uh, two goals that are in tension. One is price stability, and the other is employment. So it assumes that these are things that you can't have both. So you have to balance out, you have to prioritize them. So whenever we see on the news, prices rising, the Fed wanting to curb inflation, we get a little afraid because the point of raising interest rates is it not to disincentivize productive investment in a way that reduces employment and uh, keeps prices in line? Is that I guess one question is that what the Fed is supposed to do in your opinion? And yeah, is that what it should be doing?
Sure. So the answer from my point of view is, in a word, no. But there is a legal basis for this. And so in elaborating an answer, I guess I'll be sort of channeling the Spread the Fed book that's just come out that you kindly mentioned at the top. So there's a kind of pre-1930s Fed and a post-1930s Fed. And the story of the post-1930s Fed is a story of having corrected one mistake that was made in the pre-1930s Fed, but correcting it in a manner that overcorrected. So here's the basic story. If you think about the task of monetary policy, or what should a central authority charged with management of the money supply be doing, I think that there are two basic tasks that any monetary authority has to be responsible for. We can call one the sort of money or credit money or finance capital allocation task. And then we can call the second one the modulation task, right? So the allocation task is essentially to ensure that this endogenously generated and hence in principle indefinitely extensible supply of credit money is going toward productive outlets, that essentially it is financing the production of real goods and services that can then absorb the additional money that is put forward in order to do that financing, right? That's the allocation task. The way to mess up the allocation task, of course, or at least one way to do it, is to allow or even encourage money to flow in non-productive directions, but rather in purely speculative directions, right? In the directions of people who are essentially just placing bets on price movements in secondary securities markets or tertiary derivatives markets. That's what all of the political economists in the good old days, I think, were quite wise to refer to as just wasted investment, wasted money flows. It's sterile is another word that they would use, because it doesn't actually result in the production of real goods and services, of material wealth. So that's the allocation task. The modulation task I sort of alluded to already, but just not under that name, when I refer to the way in which inflation and deflation are relations, right? Where you want essentially to make sure that the aggregate credit money supply is moving in tandem and in parallel with the goods and services supply. So that's the modulatory task, right? Now, it's common for contemporary thinkers about central banking and monetary policy and the like, first off, just to forget or ignore, or if they don't ignore, to repudiate the allocative task altogether, right? They'll say, oh, you're picking winners and losers if you do that, or, oh, no central authority is actually, equipped to do that or competent to do that. So just leave the allocation to the private sector, leave the driving to us, as the old bus advertisements used to say. And the only thing then that the public sector should do, if anything, is to confine itself to the modulatory task, right? Now, the Fed before the 1930s had a very robust understanding of the allocative task. And they also had a theory that they used to justify it, which was half right. And that's where the problem comes in. So the theory was what's known as the real bills doctrine. Some of you might have heard about this or read about this. Of course, it's talked about in some of the stuff that I've written, particularly in the Spread the Fed book. But the real bills doctrine is essentially a doctrine that's, I think, quite correct if you're talking about endogenous money alone. And if you forget that there is an exogenous element to the money supply in addition to the endogenous element. But the real bills doctrine was basically this. It was that if basically banks issued money only in connection with productive projects, right? In other words, if banks extended credit and all credit can take various forms, short-term paper, commercial paper of various kinds and the like. But if the banks would extend credit only in connection with so-called productive projects, but also always in connection with every possible or actually sought out productive project, then the money supply would be automatically correct, right? Because there wouldn't be any more money generated than was associated with productive capacity, and there wouldn't be any less money that was generated. There wouldn't be any less generated money than was needed, right, for productive investment. So the idea was that there would be a sort of automaticity to this, right? That was the so-called real bills doctrine. And the founders of the Fed in the lead up to 1913, when the Fed, as we have it, was finally put into place, were believers in this doctrine, right? They were all, rabid real bills doctrine people, RBD advocates, right? And again, insofar as that was half right, then the Fed that they invented was half right. What was that Fed? What did it look like? Well, it's why we have 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. And a lot of people today probably wonder, or I actually know a lot of people today wonder why we even have those things. Because, of course, that function isn't believed in anymore. It's not discharged, right? And so, as one of my research assistants asked me one time, she said, well, what do those regional Feds do? Do they just write papers and stuff? I said, yeah, that's what they do. They're basically like glorified think tanks. In their defense, the think tankery is all sort of focused on their particular regional economies, right? So the Dallas Fed will be able to tell you more about the southwestern US economy than any other institution, including any university. And the San Francisco Fed will be able to tell you more about the California and Hawaiian economies than anybody else will. So they're not valueless, but it's almost as though they've got like one arm that they're sort of trying to make useful when the other arm has been severed. And what I mean by that is their original task was to understand their regional economies so that they could figure out, right, how much credit money the banks that were members of them should be disseminating, right, should be generating. Because the idea was each region sort of has its own economy. There's integration between our regional economies, but there are significant differences among them, such as then warranted distinct Feds. And so each Fed had charge of a particular region and was in close, regular contact and operational integration with the banks of that region. And they would sort of determine together how much credit money was needed and what directions it had to flow in within that particular region. And then the Fed, each regional Fed, stood ready to monetize any credit instruments that the banks held in their portfolios when they generated the loans, right? So for example, to go back to my first example where Tompkins Trust lends me money to buy a car, if they had made that loan to me, sort of under sensible conditions, if it had not been imprudently extended, and if it was sufficiently short term and hence non-risky, the New York Fed would have stood ready to buy the loan off of its books, right? It would have stood ready to buy the actual documentation of the credit that it extended off of its books and hold it on its own books. And the point of that is essentially to enable the banks to lend even more, right? Because they've got more liquidity every time they sell an asset to the Fed. So the discount window that you've heard about was really, there were 12 discount windows in effect, and each regional Fed bank would basically be willing to monetize, sort of eligible credit instruments, we might call them, right? And so the idea then was, and I sort of often refer to the original design for the Fed, as it was essentially a network of regional development finance institutions, right? Or development finance complementary institutions, right? Now, that worked really well insofar as their understanding of the real bills doctrine was correct, right? The problem was that the real bills doctrine of that period was half right, as I suggested before. And that's because, again, it sort of tended to assume, or it was predicated on the assumption that there is only endogenous money, right? Not on an understanding that there actually could be significant sources of exogenous money as well that might screw everything up. Those chickens, the chickens, I suppose you could say, of that sort of half correct but half incorrect version of the RBD, the real bills doctrine, became apparent in the immediate post-war era after the First World War. And the reason for that was that there were huge influxes of money that came into the country from Europe, right? As various European countries paid down the war debt that they had incurred to the US, as the Germans paid in reparations debt, and as all sorts of other, basically, the US had also accumulated, I think it had 60% of the world's gold stock at the end of the First World War too, right? So there was a massive growth in the money supply that was exogenously sourced. And the real bills doctrine just didn't have lenses through which to see that. It had a blind spot, so to speak, when it came to that. And so, of course, this massive influx of excess credit money in the aftermath of the First World War gave us the so-called Roaring Twenties, right? And as typically tends to happen when you've got these massive excesses like this, various Wall Streeters came up with really cool ways to gamble with it, to try to make a killing by using all of this extra money to gamble. There were also all sorts of scams and schemes in the 1920s of a kind that were really surprisingly similar to those that came to predominate in the early 21st century and culminated in 2008. People, for example, often think that real estate securitization began in the late 1990s or early 2000s. But no, there was actually a form of real estate securitization that became quite big in the 1920s. And indeed, there was a real estate bubble and bust before there was a stock market bust, right? There was a real estate crash in 1928, which not only preceded the 1929 securities markets crash, but played a role in generating it, right? But in any event, so happily, Congress and various academic thinkers, most notably the aforementioned Irving Fisher, sort of noticed this and wrote about it. And then Congress reformed the Federal Reserve System with the National Banking Act of 1935 to essentially turn the Fed into a pure modulator. And they sort of jettisoned the allocative functions, right? So it created the Federal Open Market Committee. It made focusing on the national credit money aggregate the sole real focus of the Fed. The New York Fed became then first among equals as far as the regional Feds were concerned, because it's the only regional Fed that has a permanent seat on the FOMC. And so now it was all about modulating the national credit aggregates with no attention paid to the allocative function at all. And that's the Fed that we have today, right? For all intents and purposes, that is the current Fed. And both the strengths and the weaknesses of that you can think of as almost the photographic negative of the weaknesses and strengths of the first Fed. So the argument I make, of course, in that Spread the Fed book is, let's do it Goldilocks style. Let's make it just right. You need the allocative and the modulatory functions to be discharged. You need the explicit modulatory function to be discharged because there is some exogenous money, and sometimes lots of it. Of course, Chinese money in the lead up to 2008. But you also continue to need the allocative function to see to it that there is sufficient capital for productive investment on the one hand, and therefore also you need it as a way of making the modulatory task more readily discharged, right? Because if you get allocation wrong, it's almost impossible to get modulation right in the long run, because there's going to be a tendency for the money to flow in the direction of unproductive investments, because the short-term gains that are there to be had, if you're simply betting on price movements in secondary and tertiary markets, are just much higher and more immediate than the profits that you can earn by doing sort of long-term investment. And when we turn to these sort of institutional proposals that I'm making, I can kind of elaborate a little bit more detail.
Sure.
But that's just basically, that's the sort of beginning of that discussion by way of a somewhat overly long-winded reply to your specific question.
Well, yeah, honestly, I wish I could dive even deeper into that because you've opened up so many doors. We do have a couple questions from members I wanted to ask. So
Sure.
this is a question from a member. If banks are creating money such as credits, which correlate with debts, and they aren't really waiting to get deposits before they lend the money, then it sounds like they are just monopolizing what is in fact a public utility. It seems like they're gatekeeping the monetary system, which could be run publicly without them.
Yes.
If this is about monopoly privileges conferred by the state like that, then it seems to be fundamentally politically. Is that so? And if I could just add something to that, it seems like interest fees that banks charge are just a monopoly privilege that the state
Mhm.
helps them to protect. What do you think about that?
I actually even have a name for that. I call it privatized seigniorage. right? So if anybody is not familiar with the word seigniorage, I'll explain it. I'll try to give a decent definition, and it's also fine to kind of Google it and look it up. But basically, in the old days, in the pre-modern days, when the monies that were issued and spent on feudal estates were issued by the lord or lady of the estate, that person was called the seigneur. It derived from Latin. And seigniorage was essentially the privilege that that money issuer had, essentially to issue money on his or her own behalf that wasn't, quote, backed up by anything to buy things. Or in other cases, right, the seigneur might actually file, if there were gold coins, might sort of debase the gold content of the coin and take some for himself or herself. But basically, it's the idea that if you are the central authority, let's say, and in medieval times that would be the lord, you are the issuer of what functions as a circulating medium, as a money, and you have certain privileges that you take for yourself on that basis. And so what I have argued in quite a few things that I've written and published over the years is that our particular system is a kind of franchise arrangement, where, again, the Fed is the franchisor, the banks are the franchisees, and in order to kind of incentivize the banks to sort of play their role, we basically privatize the seigniorage. We let them claim the seigniorage. As to sort of why it's like that, and as to the question of whether it has to be like that, which of course is implied in the query, the answer is it doesn't have to be like that, right? And indeed, as I'll discuss when we talk about the positive proposals, a big part of the proposal is that we sort of just outright nationalize a lot more than we used to. I think there's the charitable explanation for why we have a public-private system rather than a purely public system, I think, is that back in the days when we established this system, which basically in the system that we have now was essentially put in place in the 1860s during the Civil War. The reason I think that we went public-private in the 1860s was simply because we did not yet have adequate state capacity or technological capacity for everything to be nationalized, right? The federal government of the United States was not all powerful yet. That's part of what the Civil War was designed to sort of bring about. We also didn't have quite yet the technical capacities to sort of oversee an entire national credit system on a kind of, or in the form of a sort of electronic network. On the other hand, we did develop that capacity a lot earlier than I think a lot of people know. A lot of people probably think the capacity probably didn't come along until the 1960s or 70s. But actually, as early as 1917, with the creation of FedWire that I mentioned before, the National Electronic Payment System administered by the Fed, we could have nationalized everything and basically made all banking public as early as 1917, over 100 years ago. But in the 1860s, we weren't quite there yet, of course. And so I think to some extent, it made sense, even from a public policy point of view, to kind of lever the comparative strengths and expertises of private sector bankers who knew their communities. That's another thing, by the way, that we should keep in mind here. That it wasn't until 1997 that we allowed banks to branch across state lines. That's comparatively recent, right? So we used to require the banks to be pretty local and require them then to be locally focused. And insofar as we did that, then it wasn't completely implausible to think that they might be able to function as decent gatekeepers for the dissemination of public credit money, because they sort of knew their communities, they knew who was creditworthy and who wasn't, they knew what was likely to be productive and what wasn't. So it all made a certain sense. At least it wasn't a complete and obvious disaster ab initio in those first 50 or 60 years. But I do think that the changes that have come about since then render it both less necessary and less tolerable than it has become, right? Because once we scrapped the local banking limitations and allowed banks to sort of branch across state lines in the late 90s, thank you, Clinton. Once banks, as they grew in response to this, began to become more international in their focuses, global credit markets and the like, and more focused on the securities markets and less on productive lending, especially local business lending and the like. Well, now they basically ceased to become reliable gatekeepers, it seems to me, for the national credit money supply. And indeed, if you consider the fact that they're just acting on incentives, and we don't view those incentives, we don't treat legally those incentives as antisocial, which they actually are, but we don't treat them that way. well, then it's basically all but inevitable that they're going to screw it all up. And so for that reason, it seems to me that we should make use of the much greater state capacity and technical capacity that we have now than we had in the 1860s, and either replace those private sector banks with public sector outlets of Fed credit money, or at the very least, put in place a sort of parallel system, a kind of public option system that isn't dependent on the profit motive, and then thereby sort of slowly drive them out of business. In the same way that we did with currency itself, right? I mean, some of you guys will know, until the 1860s, the paper money supply took the form of private sector banknotes issued by private sector banks, right? And so all of your paper money basically had some bank's name on it, and different banks were differently reliable from one another, and various state bank regulators were differently reliable as well. And so all of the paper currencies out there were privately issued, and they were differently valuable. And you actually had to discount those that were issued by some banks and then treat those issued by some other banks as reliable. And that, of course, made for, a fairly inefficient transacting, like because somebody walks into your general store and they put a wad of money on the counter to buy the blankets or whatever, and you have to look at where all the notes come from, and then you have a little list behind the counter, discount, Rattlesnake Bank notes by 50%, right? And discount Wild Bill Hickok Bank's notes by 80%. If it's a Puritan or Quaker bank note from Pennsylvania or New England, counted at 100%, fairly inefficient way of doing things. We could kind of get by with that until the Civil War. And then when the federal government is having to pay and equip and you get uniforms for troops and to purchase supplies all across the northern half of the country to prosecute the war, they realized this won't do as far as paper money is concerned. And so they passed 3 enactments in rapid succession that jointly gave us the national banking system that we have today. There's the National Bank Act, the Currency Act, and the Legal Tender Act. And the most interesting thing for our purposes, I think, about those is that all of the newly, possibly nationally chartered banks, which we still to this day call national associations, they were all going to issue the same paper currency, no matter where they were. And it was called the greenback. And that was the very first paper dollar of a uniform type. And then, of course, we switched that function over to the Federal Reserve System 50 years later, once we had created it. But in any event, right, I think that another thing that happened once we did that is that it didn't take very long at all for all of those private sector banknotes to disappear, because everybody recognized the superiority of the greenbacks. So the greenbacks edged out and rendered superfluous all of the private sector paper banknotes, and hence the entire money supply came to be the greenbacks. And I believe that something similar will happen if we offer a public option with an updated electronified monetary system, that basically private sector banks aren't going to be able to compete with that. And so they'll probably just die out, which I don't think anybody's going to cry about except for the bankers themselves.
We've got a question from Alder. Professor Hockett, you say you are a fellow traveler to MMT, but not an MMTer. What
Yeah.
are your differences or objections to MMT?
I don't know if I have. It's hard to give uniform objections because, of course, they're not really as monolithic as people tend to think. But there are sort of 2 things, maybe 3 things on which I don't necessarily dramatically part company with them, but the way I see things is not uniformly and regularly acknowledged by all of them. And for that reason, I tend to be a fellow. So first off, I don't think that the understanding of endogenous money begins with Warren Mosler. All right, let's just start with that. I love Warren, we're friends, but I don't think this has sort of just been discovered, in the 1970s or 80s or something. And I want to give him all the credit he's owed. I want to give him his due. But I don't think it makes much sense. I actually think it's an injustice to all the great endogenous money theorists of centuries past to suggest that, okay, we just discovered what Warren has to say in the 1970s or 1980s. And again, a lot of the MMTers would agree, right? So they're not monolithic, but some of them don't seem to see things that way. Secondly, there's a tendency, I think, for them to focus more on the role that the public sector itself plays directly in printing money, so to speak, and in disseminating money in the form of Federal Reserve accounts to private sector banks and the like. And there's much less attention to the micro details of what the private sector banks themselves do and how they're sort of wired into the public sector, right? And again, some of them do, but a lot of them don't, or at least they don't pay much attention to that. And so they tend to think more in terms of Knapp's state theory of money than of, sort of theories of credit money, and in particular bank money, right? That's a sort of second thing that we sometimes sort of part company on. I guess there are four. The third one is, I mentioned before, there's a tendency, I think, to denigrate Marx, and a tendency to denigrate the Marxist tradition, and the left, the sort of essentially the socialist and communist traditions. Maybe that's partly thanks to Warren, because Warren, of course, is an uber capitalist, but there's a tendency, I think, to diss the venerable socialist and communist traditions out there, and a tendency to denigrate Marx in particular, which is, I find, astonishing as well as offensive, because again, there's nothing that anybody today is saying about endogenous money that wasn't already said in volume 3 of Capital. And then finally, fourthly, sort of to generalize that and the Vixel story, is there's a tendency, again, not to sort of appreciate or pay much attention to the historical lineage of this understanding, and to recognize that you can think of endogenous money theory as a great big tree, a really wide, gigantic tree with many branches, roots, twigs, and the like. And MMT is simply one twig on that tree. And I don't know if it's the scholar in me, or if it's the sort of, I have a tendency always to want to go back as far as I can to find the origins of ideas and things. And maybe owing to that taste of mine, I'm always troubled by any school of thought that seems to be less than fully cognizant of and appreciative of and thankful to the massive tradition that they are simply a part of, right, that came before. So it's, a lot of these are aesthetic differences or minor quibbles, but they're enough to make me sort of think, okay, look, I'm a fellow traveler in the sense that I think of myself as being on the same tree as you guys, and even on the same branch. But I'm sort of more excited about the tree than I am about any given twig that's on the tree.
Dominic?
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Hockett. I really appreciate you being here. And I think this is really important. I've had this understanding. I was taught this in community college 20 something years ago, about how banks generate most of our money supply this way. But I want to ask you, and you mentioned it briefly in your last response. Over the last couple of years, with all the inflation we've had, what I've heard a lot of people saying, without much to back it up, and I'm not, even though I've taken a number of economics classes in college and grad school, I'm not that much of an economist, so I don't really fully understand. But a lot of people have been saying, and people who I consider leftists, that the inflation was caused by the government printing so much money. And I want to ask you about printing money versus the way that banks generate this money, and also when people are talking about the government or the Fed printing money, are they actually talking about printing bills, actual bills, or are they talking about creating money, adding to the money supply in some other way, if that makes sense?
That makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Yeah. I think most people who say this are using that term printing metaphorically, right? I mean, the paper currency supply represents so minuscule a portion of the total money supply that if they actually did think it was literally the printing of money that causes the problem, then they would have to be sort of insane, or they would have to be profoundly ignorant of the various constituent elements that all jointly constitute the money supply. But I don't think most of them do mean it literally. I think most of them are using the term sort of, again, metaphorically. And what they basically mean is the Fed is generating more money, or is augmenting or adding to the national credit money supply. And when they blame the Fed, in doing that for inflation and the like, I think they're kind of half right, in a particular sense, right? So to go back just a teeny bit, you might remember that, before 2008, 2009, it was often said that there had been a so-called great moderation underway for about 30 years. And by that, what they meant was that there had not been, significant consumer price inflation since Volcker sort of broke the back of the last great consumer price inflation in the late 70s and early 80s. And it was true that, for 30 years, or approximately 30 years, we hadn't had that kind of inflation. But it was sort of a bizarre thing to be saying, right? Because there was a hyperinflation going on in another sector of the economy, and that was the financial sector, right? If you think about it, this is probably also, we can probably also, credit bankers and financiers who have their own agendas for this vocabularial weirdness. But they always would use a different term, of course, for financial market volatility or price instability or bubbles, and the word would be bubbles, right, or manias or whatever. But what is a mania or a bubble other than a hyperinflation, right? It was just a hyperinflation in the asset markets instead of in the goods and services markets. And I blame the Fed for this in part, but I don't want to sort of suggest that the Fed is somehow disproportionately to blame for this. The Fed was simply acting on an orthodoxy that was much broader than the Fed itself or Fed thinking or Fed research departments. And the orthodoxy just was, right, that there's no such thing as inflation in asset markets. That bubbles, if they can exist, and indeed some people like Eugene Fama at Chicago argued that bubbles aren't even metaphysically possible, but the Greenspan version of this was slightly less crazy, but still crazy, which was that, well, even if bubbles can happen, there's no way to spot them when they're happening. So all you can do is wait for them to burst, and then you clean up afterwards, right? That was the conventional wisdom among economists across the country. And sometimes this is sort of referred to as the lean versus clean debate. So before the 1980s or before the 1970s, certainly, a lot of people understood the necessity of a counter-cyclical role that the Fed should take. And this is sort of best captured in the witticisms of William McChesney Martin, who's probably the greatest Fed chair that you never heard of, but who served longer than anybody but Greenspan. I think it was from Truman to early Nixon. But he had these two quips to describe the role of the Fed. He said the role of the Fed is to take away the punch bowl just as the party's getting good. And maybe more thoroughly, he said the role of the Fed is to lean against the wind. This is essentially a nice sort of sloganist articulation of what I was referring to before as the modulatory task, right? The idea is that the Fed should be operating as a gigantic market contrarian, so that if prices are going up, it should be exercising downward pressure. If prices are going down, it should be exerting upward pressure. And if you did that, you would narrow the band within which prices fluctuated, and that means less volatility by definition and less inflation or deflation by definition. That was the idea of leaning. Unfortunately, by the 70s and 80s, leaning fell out of favor among so-called monetary intellectuals. These are the ones who were saying that either bubbles can't happen or that you can't spot them in advance, and therefore, so their claim was that you should clean after a disaster, but you shouldn't try to do anything to sort of preempt a disaster or prevent it from happening. This was an amazingly bullshit view. The idea was that, well, you can't tell, right? Because there's no way to determine what is fundamental value versus, sort of temporary inflated bubble value, right? But it's very easy. There are all sorts of proxies for fundamental value that you can look at in a case like this, right? Take housing, for example. This is one of my mentors, one of my teachers in grad school was Robert Schiller, who wasn't quite as famous back then because he hadn't got his Nobel yet. But he, I think, very helpfully pointed out, well, actually, if you see, the price curve for housing, shooting up, but the price curve for building materials is not, well, you can take the building materials curve as a reasonable proxy for fundamental value. And if you add labor in and note that labor costs haven't gone up that much either, and then if at the same time you note that credit aggregates are something like 10 times what they used to be, seems pretty clear, right? That the prices here are being credit generated rather than fundamentals generated. And there are similar proxies that you can use for fundamental value across multiple markets. And even if you don't have those, if you just notice that the credit supplies have quadrupled or quintupled or whatever, and that's not that difficult for the Fed to track either, well, then, at the very least, you've got a rebuttable presumption in favor of the hypothesis that this is a credit-generated bubble. It's essentially a case of too much credit money chasing too few goods, right? But the people who claimed that you couldn't do that, in a sense, basically then told us, don't look for bubble generation in advance. Just wait for disasters, and then try to mop up as best you can, get the blood off the floor, but don't worry about don't mourn the dead. Just clean up the blood, after they're all dead. And so I think that's what happened. So I blame the Fed in a sense, but I also blame the Fed. I sort of modify the blame in the sense that I blame the Fed as one exponent, and arguably the practically most important exponent of a much wider field of people who all shared a point of view. And I would probably therefore be more inclined to blame the finance economists and the orthodox macroeconomists at all the universities who taught all of the personnel at the Fed. Right? I think I want to hold them even more responsible. I hope, is that responsive?
Yeah, that's really a good answer. I appreciate that. And just a quick technical question, or maybe it's quick, I hope. So I understand how the banks generate this money, but what is it the Fed actually does to increase or decrease supply?
Oh, so how does it sort of determine whether they're sort of disseminating credit in the wrong directions or over
well, I mean, like, what's the like? What are they doing? Like, I like with a bank, like you said, they put in this credit system that we've credited this amount to his account, and the other banks honor this, and it turns into money. But what does the Fed do exactly that changes, that creates money or takes it out?
No, that's a really great question.
Yeah, I just want to, Robert, I want to be able to have time to get to the second part, but you can finish the question. But I know that's a very broad question, so
yeah, I think I can give you a really quick and dirty answer, Dominic, and then further elements of an answer might come out of the second half when we talk about the next paper. But the quick and dirty answer is that after we sort of eliminated those regional restrictions on bank branching, there emerged a kind of a two-tier banking system, right? We had large banking institutions that took advantage of the removal of those barriers to interstate banking and branching and became big mega banks. And then there were other banks that stayed relatively small and that are still with us to this day that we call community banks or special sort of industry sector-specific banks, right? That maybe specialize in extending credit to railroad companies or steel mills or what have you, right? But the key to the answer to your question is that larger sector now that has become massive ever since the late 1990s. Those are the banks that the Fed pays the most attention to and works with the most. And those are the banks whose credit generation the Fed, in effect, valorizes or backstops or endorses now in a way that would not have been possible because such banks barely even existed before the 1990s. And so that's the primary entry point. That's where the Fed is. And the QE programs that the Fed adopted, particularly the first two QEs, QE1 and QE2, were the names that we can give to the actual programs pursuant to which the Fed decided to take on the role of monetizing non-monetary instruments issued by these banking institutions, right? So the monetizing of personal loans, like if I borrow to buy a car, that's still going on, but that's not where the excess credit generation is happening. It's happening in those mega banks that have emerged in the wake of the 1990s. And that's precisely why then the excess credit has flowed in the direction of hyperinflating the asset markets, the financial markets, rather say than hyperinflating the automobile markets or the consumer goods markets or what have you, right? So I hope that that's at least somewhat